Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political systems and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. And here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome everyone to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this, the 29th day of October. We have two more left. Valentine's, Halloween's Day is the day after tomorrow, and that was a misstatement. I don't really believe that it's February, but anyway. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to engage in yet another of our programs here at the Virtual Center. I look forward to them, and I take very, very seriously your willingness to join me on these treks through, what admittedly, and I think this is very significant, what is admittedly to many, many people, to most people, pretty mundane, boring stuff, and we're going to see that today, I think. And I mean, I'm not saying leave now, because this is going to be 2 hours of boring stuff. But I think the fact that some of this information related to the Constitution is so complicated and so confusing, so complex, is not really accidental at all. I think it is designed to produce or to create a specific reaction, and indeed it's creating that. Students find nothing as boring as a study on government, on structures of government, on political branches of government. Remember the old thing about how a bill becomes a law? I mean, that's a classic. Because not only is it a classic piece of Americana in terms of how a bill becomes a law in our legislative system, but also it's a piece of pretty good material, pretty good substance on how to turn off tens of millions of students over the years. Because ultimately, when you get, when you really get your arms around it, what you're beginning to realize is that if you make it to the very end, you're nowhere. What have you effectively accomplished? And I would suggest to you that that's not a reflection. I don't believe that that's not a reflection on the substance or the quality or the talents and abilities of the people studying it. I think in large part, a lot of this is I think a significant part of the presentation itself. I think it is designed to effectively do what in fact it is doing, and that is to essentially convince an awful lot of people that this is so complicated that let's just let somebody else figure it out, because I don't have time, and the point is, if I slug through it and really try to figure it out, I can't do it anyway, and even if I do figure it out, what does it matter? And so over the years and through the generations, I think we've developed a culture which the general tendency of people is, let's let somebody else who really cares about this stuff figure it out. I mean, that's why we have attorneys. That's why we have law schools. They get fabulous salaries. Let them not worry about how this works. And that's absolutely perfect in terms what I think is really the overall meaning and intent of this. So. Of this material. So anyway, I don't mean to suggest that today I'm intentionally going into a 2-hour program with the idea that I've really spent a lot of time and research time collecting boring information. I hope I have. I may have, but I don't know that until it's over. It's kind of interesting because just touching for a moment on yesterday's program, just kind of pull that together. This morning in the class that I do with senior citizens at the Beckley Shepherd Center on Tuesday mornings, I shared with them the document that we used yesterday, the article from the Stone, from the columns in the New York Times on the issue of free markets and the idea of morality and justice. And, the models of John Rawls and his book on theory of justice in 1971, and then Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, written in 1974. And basically tried to, and again, the seniors, the senior citizens I had in my class, they were about 9 or 10. At first, their sense is, this is philosophy. There's no way in the world we can understand this. But the fact of the matter is, we can understand this. And once you do understand it, then, and this I found this morning. I mean, I watched these people interact with me and with each other over this material in ways that I found very, very enlightening, because it kind of reinforced the idea that none of this stuff is too complicated and too complex for anybody that I know. And I think that it gets a bad rap. I think education and students in today's world, both of these get a bad rap. I think teachers oftentimes, my students can't do that. My students won't read this. My students can't do this. And in fact, they can and they would if they have a reason to. And if we can somehow package this and put it together in such a way that it really has meaning for them, and it produces some sort of a positive outcome, some sort of a positive good comes out of this, whether it's in their understanding of the system or their ability to appreciate the system, or in this case of these two theories, an ability to use these theories in ways which help us understand so much of what's happening in the world around us, which is really what that class at the Shepherd Center is about anyway. The official title of the class, which I've been teaching it, as I mentioned, for 16 or 17 years. And as I recall, the official title of the class in the structural organization of the Shepherd Center is a class on life enrichment. And for a number of years, it intimidated me to think that I was teaching a class on life enrichment. But increasingly, what I found is that life is enriched the more of it we can begin to understand and get our arms around and make sense out of. The more we can make sense of the world around us, the more enriching life becomes for everybody. And so to imply, as our education system does, that only a few people are capable of understanding and dealing with this kind of complexity, and the vast majority is not capable of doing so, I believe is not just a mistake. I think it has serious political ramifications. And I have to believe that the political ramifications of this were not unknown to those who essentially set up this process. And again, this is no, in no way am I attacking the credibility or the honesty or the sincerity or the morality or anything else of the founders. I really am confident that there's nobody involved in the study of this period that appreciates the people who participated in it more than I do. And one of the things that I appreciate as much as anything else is their honesty, if you can find it. In other words, if you can cut through the rhetoric and the politics and all the rest of it, and you can begin to pull out exactly what these people believed and what they meant by what they believed and why they felt you had to do it that way, then their credibility and their honesty and their sincerity and all the rest of it, their patriotism and everything else is beyond question. They did what they felt they had to do in a world which they struggled very, very hard to figure out. And once they believed that they had figured things out, then they basically came up with a system that they felt was most appropriate for the most people in that system. But I do believe that there was an ongoing assumption that kind of drove this whole thing, that the masses of the people, and we've seen all sorts of quotations here at the Virtual Center to kind of reinforce this idea, that the masses of the people were incapable of understanding some of these complexities. And that's okay, because the people who had the most difficulty would have the most difficulty understanding it are the very same people with the least ability to contribute anything positive to it. So therefore, if they're willing to defer to their betters, then why don't we just focus our attention on the betters in the first place? And I think that really defines, at least from my understanding, what really has driven our system of public education in the United States since the beginning. I think you can see it in Benjamin Rush. I think you can see it in George Washington. I think you can see it in Thomas Jefferson and his bill for the general diffusion of knowledge in Virginia. I think, and sometimes it blows people away, because when you read these documents, you begin to find that some of the language they use is so honest that they are really putting in there what they believe. And the only way to get a handle on this is to go to the source, and very, very few people do that, and that's what we're doing here. And I believe it pays dividends. It pays big dividends. And I think the one thing that it reinforces more and more and more is that people who for generations have been written off as incapable of understanding and participating actively, positively, in making positive contributions to society or to the needs of society, I think what we're finding more and more is that these assumptions are unfounded, or at least pretty much for the most part unfounded. And in fact, and I found this with this document. I mentioned yesterday that this particular document we looked at yesterday, because it focused on philosophy, it was a little bit heavy, and it was going to be a little bit hard to figure out, and a little bit difficult to get our arms around and to understand. But I know that I had a class this morning of 8 or 9, 10, about 10 senior citizens, and I, again, I'm a senior citizen, and I probably, next to, other than one other person, two of the people in that room were younger than I. And so that means that 7 or 8 of them are quite a bit older than I am. And a few of them are retired teachers, but not all of them were. But what I found this morning in the conversation that this document generated was that all of these people, once they understood the meaning of the concepts, could engage in discussion and debate and really left the room understanding what they were talking about. And I had that very positive feeling, and the only thing, and I told them that I was hopeful that the response to the program here yesterday at the Virtual Center was equally positive. I was just hoping that I had been able to present this material in such a way that it made sense and was meaningful to the people that were tuned in to the Virtual Center on yesterday's program. But very honestly, what we find, and this came out in discussion this morning, and I'm not going to belabor this because I don't want to rehash yesterday's entire program, but I did want to make these references to it. What we had, if you recall, are two theories which kind of form opposite poles in Western political discourse and have for a long time. And one of them is the idea that justice, morality, a just society or a moral society, is one in which we, as students of it, look very carefully at the results, at the outcomes of that society in order to make a determination about justice and morality. If there's too much disparity between the successful and the unsuccessful, If the gap is too wide between those who have a lot and those who have very little, if not nothing, then you got a morality problem. You have a justice problem. And consequently, it behooves us as a society to move in and do what is necessary to fix that problem. That's John Rawls. That's his theory of justice. That's considered to be one of the best and strongest arguments for the ideology that we refer to today as liberalism. The idea that as members of a society or a community or a nation, we are part of something bigger than ourselves. And that means that we have responsibilities to each other. And what makes civilized society civilized, what makes human beings human, is their willingness and their ability to take care of others around them, is their willingness to live by the golden rule. And that, according to John Rawls, is the best definition that one could arrive at of what we mean by a just society. The way you determine justice is by the outcomes. And then you move in and you reconfigure the outcomes in such a way that everybody ends up with at least something. People's minimal needs are taken care of. That's what a humane, just society must do, according to Rawls. And so redistribution of goods and services is a key part of this whole society, this whole liberal society process. The other side, at the other pole, is Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, written in 1974, in which he is convinced, in which he argues, that a just society is made just, not by the outcomes, but by the process, by the way it operates. If the system is fair, if the market is allowed to operate freely, if we really do have a laissez-faire free enterprise society where there's no interference, no effort at redistribution, and the laws of the market, the laws of free exchange, buying and selling, supply and demand, are allowed to operate as nature intended them to operate. In other words, these are modeled on the idea of the laws of nature, the laws of the universe. They operate by themselves. And what we have to do is allow the laws of the market to operate unfettered or unimpeded or uninterfered with by anybody. And if you do that, that's the ticket, that's the road to justice. But if you're committed to the fact that the process is moral, then you cannot be affected by the outcomes. You cannot focus on the outcomes. Because the fact of the matter is, people are going to end up unequal. Inequality is going to become a feature of your society. And the only way to explain it and the only way to justify it is to conclude that if everything is operating the way it ought to be, then everybody involved in the process ends up only with what they deserve. If you end up to be successful, it's because you deserve to be successful. If you end up to be not successful, then that's because you deserve not to be successful. And to look to somebody else, to society as a whole, to move in at the 11th hour and compensate for your inadequacy is, according to the quotes that we looked yesterday, Jeff Sessions, the Republican senator from Alabama, for example, as the best example, to move in and tamper with a process that was fair and just to begin with is not to be moral, it is to be immoral. In other words, the process is where morality and justice comes from, not the product, not the end game. So consequently, you have to look at inequality in the distribution of goods and services as a logical outcome of a fair moral process. And if you accept that, if that is okay with you, then that means that you have to reject taking any kind of action based on the outcomes, on the results. If you start tampering with the results by trying to make the degree of inequality that results a little bit less, to try to receive a little bit, to achieve a little bit more balance, to try to guarantee that nobody totally falls through the crack, nobody in this society starves, nobody dies because they're denied health care, nobody should be homeless, nobody should be denied a nutritious diet, nobody should be denied education. In other words, if you're committed to those kinds of things, if that's your definition of justice, then you are not an acolyte or a follower of the Nozick principle. If you are an acolyte, a supporter of Nozick, of the free market, then you have to believe that justice and morality are taken care of in the process itself, and that the only role that the state has then is to make sure that the market is allowed to operate unimpeded, unfettered in every way, that the free market and the rules of the market are allowed to function unimpeded, and to protect citizens from fraud and theft and violence and all the rest of it. So in other words, the role of the state in the free market model is clearly defined and very limited. And that's why, we didn't go here yesterday, but that's why those who are most committed to it today will constantly go back to Locke and some of the enlightened thinkers and look for justifications, Adam Smith and all the rest of it, to the idea of unregulated free enterprise, the laws of the market, and allowing natural law to dominate. And of course, at the time of the Enlightenment, at the time of the founders, the general impression, the general assumption was that the most perfect operating procedure that there is nature itself. Nature is the product of the Creator. And nature functioning as nature was designed to function is the ideal. And to set up an economic system modeled on nature itself must be the ideal system, because nature is ideal. So therefore, the moral thing to do, the just thing to do, is to let the process happen and basically live with the results. It's very obvious to everybody that has, that understands these two theories. It's very obvious, if you understand Nozick, to realize why certain people advocate that process. Because once you become successful in that process, you're able to do things in preparation for the future which guarantees your success the next time. In other words, the more the competition goes on, the stronger you get and the better able to compete you are. So the key is survival. And from survival comes strength. And part of your strength is based on the fact that your competition is disappearing. You're eliminating your competition as you go along. So each time you compete, you're a little bit stronger than the last time, which makes it a little bit more difficult for your competitors to compete. So consequently, they tend to fall by the wayside, and you become more powerful, more capable, more competent, and your success becomes more assured. And so therefore, those who are at the top of the heap right now naturally will support a system like this, because it's a system that's going to reward the strong and the powerful, and it's going to allow the powerful and the strong to stay powerful and strong, because it argues against any interference from the state or anybody else. It's a system based on people's faith that the system is functioning fairly and honestly. And the role of the state is to do everything that it can do to guarantee that, to convince people that indeed the market is being allowed to function fairly, etc. And the logical outcomes of this theory are that if you end up on top, if you end up very successful, you can kind of take tremendous pride in the fact that in a fair, competitive competition, you prevailed. And you can take comfort and joy in that. You can be proud of that. But the other side of the coin is equally important. If you believe that the system is fair and honest and the market is functioning the way it was designed to function, if you believe that the free exchanges in the market are really free and exactly operating the way they ought to, and if you end up to be unsuccessful, if you lose, then you have absolutely no option except to attribute your loss to your own deficiencies. If there's nobody to blame for what happened to you except you, then you are confronted with the fact that it's the absence of your own talent, your own skills, your own abilities, your own insights, whatever it happens to be. So consequently, the system encourages you to accept failure as being your own failure. And if you take this process and you expand upon it in today's world, then you've got a contradiction. Well, you don't have necessarily a contradiction. You could have a contradiction. Let me rephrase that. You got a problem. The problem is that if you look around in American society today, the gap between the 1% and everybody else is wider than it's ever been. Not only that, the gap between the top tenth of the 1% and the other 9/10 of the 1% is huge. The inequality that the system is producing today in society is unheralded. And the danger is whether in fact our Republican form of government, our republic, our community can survive this kind of inequality and disparity. More and more we're beginning to find sources of people who are writing and are predicting some sort of upheaval in society, revolution. More and more articles, more and more people that you talk to are basically saying, if something doesn't change, we're going to have a revolution in this country. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this in the last 6 months. The data is so dramatically unfair and unjust to most people. The results are so skewed in favor of the few at the expense of the many that it's becoming extremely difficult for the Robert Nozicks of the world to convince themselves that the system is fair and that justice is operating as it should, and that these results are justified and deserved from a system. This is morality. To allow the system to continue to do what it's doing is the most moral thing we can do, is what Nozick would say in today's world, which is 50 years after he wrote his book, 40 some odd years. The disparity is becoming so huge that the message is not getting through anymore. More and more we're running into people who refuse to believe it. More and more we're running into people who are focusing on the examples, on the specific examples of unfairness in the system. More and more people are pointing to the supports that are being given to corporations by the courts and by government. The fact that tax breaks are being given to the wealthy to a degree that the average person is not able to take advantage of. The fact that we have very wealthy people in corporations who are paying no taxes or almost no taxes, in a system where most middle-class people are complaining because they feel like they're being buried in taxes. Yet the fact of the matter is the most successful people in our society aren't paying any. If you look just at one example, if you look at the Social Security system and the current cap on Social Security taxation, as you know, you pay a certain proportion, you pay taxes on your Social Security up to a certain point. And after that point, you don't pay anymore. So what that means is the poor proportionally are paying more taxes proportionally on Social Security than the very wealthy, because the very wealthy are finding that the bulk of their income they don't have to pay Social Security tax on. So the working poor pays Social Security on every dollar they make until your income exceeds, I can't remember exactly what the number is now, something like $95,000 a year, $114,000 a year, something like that. But you pay Social Security taxes up to that point. But if your income is $250,000 a year or $500,000 a year or $750,000 a year, you pay no Social Security taxes beyond the cap, which means that the majority of the money, the bulk of the money that you're making on income is free of Social Security tax. And if Social Security is in trouble, then the most logical person in the world would look at it and say, all you have to do is lift that cap. And everybody who works pays Social Security tax on everything they make, and that extra money going into the Social Security fund would guarantee the stability of Social Security for generations to come. It's so simple, it's absurd. But it doesn't happen. It seems fair. It seems just. It seems moral. Why doesn't it happen? And increasingly, people's conclusions are because those people that are reaping the most benefit from the current system don't want that kind of change. And the way they're defending it is going back to Robert Nozick. So the irony here is incredible. In 1974, Robert Nozick writes a book in which he's trying to explain the connection between the free market and justice, morality. And people who are taking it, who are benefiting from that definition, from that explanation, are using his work as a justification for no change. And as the disparities between wealth and power in America become greater and greater, as inequality in the distribution of goods and services becomes wider and wider, fewer and fewer people are inclined to accept that as just, as moral. What this article points out is that since the 1970s, Western societies that have been Rawlsian, in other words, have been based on the idea of the welfare state and the idea of safety nets and guarantees to protect everybody, have been increasingly evolving more and more towards the Nozick idea of the fact that morality is in the process, not in the results. And the appeal is obvious, because the appeal of Nozick is that we have no responsibilities to each other at all. Whatever we end up with, we deserve to have. And whatever you don't end up with, you deserve to not have. And that's fine if everybody's doing okay. But when you get into a period hit by the recession that we had in this country, and you get so many people that are not doing okay, and you find people that have struggled mightily trying to get back on their feet and work their way through and out of the recession, are beginning to see that the recovery from this recession is the slowest ever. And it seems forever that these jobs are taking to come back. That the jobs that were abolished in the recession, many people begin to realize will never come back. And that people who have been forced, have been laid off or unemployed or reduced from full-time to part-time or whatever else happened to them in their jobs, have been forced to take other jobs at less pay, less benefits, and all the rest of it. The result is that the recession has created this tremendous dislocation in society where everything is moved. Houses have been lost. People have lost their homes. On the other hand, the very wealthy, the people with money, have been able to move in and buy up lucrative pieces of property for a song because they were foreclosed on people who couldn't pay exorbitant mortgages, which the banks pushed. And you go on and on and on. And meanwhile, everybody's saying government shouldn't regulate, government shouldn't control, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, and that point to many people seems to be getting closer and closer, those whose vision is focused on the future begin to say, if something drastic doesn't change, we're going to have a revolution in this country. And we're seeing more and more examples of just that. And so the fact of the matter is, if you believe in this society, if you believe in this republic, if you believe in the potential of this republic, if you believe that America really is an exceptional place, that the American public is indeed exceptional, that there is really something called American exceptionalism, but that exceptionalism is not where we've been and where we've come from, What makes American society exceptional is where it might go, where it has the potential to go. We still have the potential to produce the greatest good for the most people of any society in the history of the world. But you can't do it when a few people are controlling everything and more people find themselves struggling to even keep up. When you're beginning to see, for example, that we are currently looking at the first younger generation that honestly doesn't believe that its standard of living is going to be higher than the current one. We've turned a corner here where more and more people are beginning to think that the future is not going to be as good as the present, and the present is not as good as the past. And I would suggest that that's the kind of fodder that produces revolution. There has to be a change. People have called here to the virtual center, have called in, and have sent me emails, and they're talking about corporations, and they're saying as long as the corporations control all the money and make all the decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very important that we think seriously about what we're talking about here. Are we talking about abolishing corporations? Are we talking about a government that has the power? Are we talking about a return to progressivism and Theodore Roosevelt, a government that regulates corporations and tries to make sure that everybody abides by and follows the rules? Are we talking about a society where because it's unfair you abolish it and start all over again? Or are we talking about a society where in a very, very gradual but very concentrated way we begin to encourage people to realize that we're all in this together and we all sink or float together? And what we have to do, I believe, and that's why the virtual center exists as far as I'm concerned, is to go back to the founders and try to create what they really believed they were creating. The kind of republic where virtue was real, where concern for one's fellow man was real, where humanity was real. Something happened. There's one line, and I'm about to end this soliloquy here and get into something more substantive, but all of this was generated by this document yesterday. I think it was a wonderful document, not because of what it says, but because of what it potentially means and what you can do with it and where you can go with it. So I'm not going to go on forever here, but I really believe that one of the lines that I've read that probably struck me more than anything else. Let me go back a bit. One of the most powerful and well-written pieces of history that I've read in a long time is Gordon Wood's book, written in the early 90s, called The Radicalism of the American Revolution. And Gordon Wood's thesis in that book is to suggest that where most people compare the American Revolution to other revolutions in the world, like the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, and point out that we don't seem to have the level of the degree of violence and destruction associated with our revolution that occurred in these others. I mean, these others were real revolutions, real effort to totally destroy the existing society. And most people know that the leaders of the movement for American independence wanted no part of that. They weren't that kind of revolutionary. They didn't want that. You know, these were attorneys and planters and lawyers and merchants and investors and businessmen and bankers and very, very religious people, for the most part. These weren't revolutionaries. They didn't want to destroy society. They weren't anarchists. They believed that they had the makings of the best society possible at that time. And they wanted to preserve it. But at the same time, they wanted to preserve it as independent states from the British Empire rather than as colonies of an empire where the major decisions were made somewhere else. I think that there's an element of sincerity and nobility and honesty and justice that you see coming through, oozing through everywhere in the founders, in what they say, in what they said to each other, in what they said in their speeches, etc., etc. It's not all rhetoric. It's not all meaningless rhetoric. Many of these people believed it. If you read Jefferson, if you read Benjamin Rush, and you read his Mode of Education, Proper and Republic, he's not writing an article as a term paper in a class for 3 credits. I mean, he's pouring out his soul in order to lay out for people what he really believes we need to do in terms of education to make this great potential that we have before us as a republic, to make it work. And I appreciate that. It's not necessary that you agree with him, but it's important that you respect what he's trying to do. Anyway, back to the point I was making, Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. Gordon Wood basically argued that because of the changes that the revolution seemed to bring, not only within America, but the impact that it had on other peoples in other nations around the world, the American Revolution changed everything. If you look at it the right way, Gordon Wood argued, the American Revolution is one of the most important, significant movements in the history of man. And my point is, it ain't over yet if we get back to our roots and we do what we should be doing. The fun has just begun. I really believe that. Back to my point about one of the most significant lines I've read in all of this in the last year. Toward the end of his book, in fact, at the very end of his book, Gordon Wood makes a comment, and he cites Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, in the 1830s. And he basically makes the point that Emerson made the point that by the 1820s and 1830s, many of the founders have passed away or are passing away, are dying, or have already died. And Emerson makes the point, according to Wood, that none of the original founders died happy. That all of them died, all of them left this life feeling that the potential that they had contributed to giving this nation was not being realized. Many of them became disenchanted. Many of them became concerned that they had too positive a view of human nature. Most people see the idealism of 1776 contrasted with the realities of the Constitution in 1787 as a reflection of the fact that some of the framers of the Constitution, the real key people, Madison and Hamilton and the others, believed that the idealism of 1776 was unfounded. We had too much faith in people's ability to govern themselves. We never should have done that. We went too far. We were naive, blah, 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 blah. But anyway, back to 1830s and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In Emerson's statement that none of the founders died happy, this is the statement that probably has moved me more than anything else that I've read in the last year. I've thought about this a lot. And what I've concluded in speculating why the founders would feel this way, I've concluded that the answer must be that most of them believed that we were not following through on what they had given us, that the potential that they had seen in independence was somehow being squandered, and that things were not working out the way they originally were envisioned to work. And Emerson makes another comment, which is a political comment. And this is the coup d'etat. This is the most telling comment of all. Because Emerson is living during the period of so-called Jacksonian democracy. He has lived through the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is portraying himself as the hero of the common man. And this period is being discussed and talked about by political leaders and by commentators as the period of Jacksonian democracy. This is the period when the common man came into his own. This is the period when the potential of America began to surface. Because this is the period when man began to realize in America that being common was okay. That it was okay if you didn't like classical music. It was okay if you didn't like philosophy. It was okay if you didn't like political theory. It was okay if you didn't like the arts and architecture and all the rest of it. It was okay if your education was only basic and minimal. It was a society where the masses of the people began to look at, askance at the well-educated and the highly cultured. This is the period when the social gap began to emerge between the upper classes and the lower classes, because this is a period when the lower classes began to vote. The property qualifications were all dropped, the political process was opened up, and political campaigning began to appeal to the masses of the people. Alcohol it was everywhere at polling places. And candidates were pitching in their political speeches, seeking the votes of the average guy, of the working people. And the whole period produced Andrew Jackson. And Emerson's comment was, to think that a nation that was founded hoping that its young would turn out to be like George Washington had now become a nation where too many of the young wanted to be like Andrew Jackson. Think about that. Instead of the optimum hero of the American Republic being George Washington, during this period, Washington is being pushed into the background and replaced by Andrew Jackson, by the raw, uncut, uncouth, unsophisticated behavior and character and language and dress of Andrew Jackson. And we know, of course, that Jackson was a millionaire and that a lot of this was political show. And what that means is, what we're seeing in this period is the emergence of a political system which is catering to the common man and his participation in American politics. But here's what I think Emerson was most worried about. Was this period of Jacksonian democracy a period in which the common man began to realize that in this nation he could make it big, he could become successful, each individual could reach their full potential, that the combination of the resources available to them and the freedom provided them gave every individual an opportunity to reach his own potential, whatever that might be, or her own potential, whatever that might be. The American dream. Is that what the Jackson period of the emergence of the common man was about? It's my guess that Emerson didn't believe that. It's my sense that Emerson believed that what we were looking at in the 1830s, late 20s and 30s, was not a recognition that America was a place where common people could work hard and become not common. Rather, what America was becoming was a society in which common people were being encouraged to believe that it was okay to be common. In other words, accept your lot if you work hard and you go to work every day and you do what you're supposed to do. That's the American dream. That's what America's about. And I would suggest to you that the gap that we see today between those who subscribe to the philosophy of Robert Nozick and those who still dream of a just society in the model of John Rawls. The classic example is played out in this period 170 some odd years ago over whether America was a society where common people could become successful enough if they worked hard and applied themselves to move forward and cease to be common, or whether, in fact, American people were being encouraged to accept the idea that it was okay to be common in this society. They were being encouraged to accept their lot, and the people that were encouraging to do that are the people that were moving ahead and out in front and on top. I don't hear anything different in the last presidential campaign when Mitt Romney was talking about the 47% of the takers than I heard from Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 1830s. And if that's what American society seemed to be becoming to him, then no wonder the founders did not die happy. Because Emerson believed, and I believe, that that's not what the founders intended. That's not American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is what these people could become, not a conscious campaign to convince them that what they had not become was okay. I think we've got to wrestle with that, and I think that I'll be honest. I think that's what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. Well, if you're a public radio fan on Saturdays and you listen to Car Talk, you may recognize the fact that when Car Talk goes off the air at the end of its hour, it usually goes off with a statement of something like, "Well, you've wasted another hour of your time." We are at the top of our first hour. So we have basically reached the midpoint in today's session of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is now 5 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause and take a break for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come back, and I promise you we will do something a little bit more substantive and a little bit less evangelical in hour number 2. I'm Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, and after a short break, we'll be back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and again, it is a pleasure to be with you. If you have been with us through the first hour, I thank you for staying with us. If you are just joining us, then welcome to today's program, and we appreciate your joining us. And I think very honestly, if there are people that have been with us through the first hour and are still with us, then I think that speaks well to the fact that you want to hang around for a while and give us an opportunity, not here only at the Virtual Center, but on the network itself, on the Head On Radio network. I think one of the, obvious things, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in the first hour talking about a document that we pretty well worked over yesterday in our program yesterday. But I really felt that, well, we worked over the documents themselves. We didn't really concentrate as much on the implications and the meaning of the document, and that's what I kind of wanted to do today. Although I must admit, I didn't figure that I would spend an entire hour of our program on it, but that's okay. Because I think if these things do have any meaning and any value, it's because they have meaning and value in the ways that we understand the things that are happening around us, the world around us. That's what education's about. Anyway, it seems to me. And so if that's what we're focusing on, is what is the meaning of what we talked about yesterday in terms of people's day-to-day lives today, and we were able to come up with substantive contributions that seemed to justify the time that we took yesterday on these documents, then to a degree, education or something resembling it has happened. And that's really what we're looking for, what we hope for. One of the things I realized at the end of the hour is I never gave the phone number. I never gave people an email address to write to or anything else with reactions or comments or criticisms or suggestions or anything. So let me make up for that right now by telling you that we have a phone number. If you would like to participate, it will get you on the air right away. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. It's really a very easy number to remember. 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to email me directly with your comments, suggestions, ideas, not only about this topic or this program, but perhaps other programs as well. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, no punctuation, @gmail.com. And if you take the time to email me with a suggestion or something thoughtful, I promise you that I will make every effort in the world to respond to you in kind. And what I mean is, if you take the time to email me, I sure as heck will take the time to respond to you and to respond appropriately. I mentioned at the end of our last hour that we would be doing something more substantive this hour than we did in the first hour. I honestly believe that, every once in a while you come across a document, whether it's an article or quotations or whatever, that is so rich and so meaningful and has so much to say that you can just expand and go on with it for a long time. And the fact of the matter is, the more you can draw out of a piece of writing like that, the more substantive it is. It seems to me, the better, the more meaningful it is for people. In other words, that if you spend a lot of time in a document and you leave with something positive, then it's been a tremendous investment of your time and energy. And I think this particular article that we looked at yesterday, which examines the two opposites, John Rawls at one pole and Robert Nozick at another, is a good example of that. And so I'm not at all uncomfortable about the time we put into it. It's just a little bit more than I had anticipated. The virtual center on the Constitution of the United States, on the study of the Constitution of the United States and civic responsibility, obviously is based principally on the Constitution itself. And we all know, and we've done quite a bit of work in the past here at the Virtual Center on this, that most people consider the Federalist Papers to be probably some of the greatest commentary on the internal operations and meaning of the Constitution of the United States that existed. It's very important, however, that people keep in mind the political context in which the Federalist Papers were written. The Federalist Papers are a series of 85 essays that appeared in the papers of New York, the state of New York, in order to encourage New York citizens to vote for supporters of the Constitution as representatives to the ratifying convention on the Constitution. In other words, the contest over the Constitution in every state produced competition. And by ratifying the Constitution with special conventions of the people in each state, and that's exactly what the Constitution contains in the ratification process. In other words, written into the Constitution is the procedure for ratifying it. And the decision that the convention made was that the Constitution would be ratified state by state in special conventions of the people convened for that purpose, for the purpose of ratifying the Constitution of the United States. And that meant that there was an election contest in each state between Federalists and anti-Federalists. And we've touched before on the fact that those labels have been juxtaposed. The supporters of the Constitution were very adept and shrewd in seizing upon the word Federalist as the name for their position. Because the fact of the matter is, it was very important to citizens that the government created be seen as a federalist rather than a nationalist document, institution. Citizens were very jealous of the power of their own states. And they weren't inclined to support any government change, any constitutional system that did damage to the existence or to the autonomy of their own states. And by selecting the word Federalist, supporters of the Constitution were able to capture that sentiment by suggesting that the side they advocated was the side of federalism, the side which advocated a distribution of power between central government and states. And, of course, the only label left then for the opposition were the anti-federalists. But the fact of the matter is the anti-federalists were really the federalists. Because the people opposed to the Constitution opposed it because of the damage it promised to do to the states. So they were the real federalists. But the other side grabbed the name. Politically shrewd. That's kind of an example of the contest and the struggle that's going on. Anyway, there were 85 essays written in the papers of New York, and of course these things are picked up out of the New York papers and reprinted in states throughout the 13, as well as Europe, as well as Great Britain. And these 85 essays were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And they weren't signed by those people. They were all signed Publius. In other words, the same signature occurs at the end of all 85 Federalist Papers. And what the authors of the Federalist Papers do is walk through the entire constitutional system, taking it upon themselves to comment upon the criticisms of the Constitution and then focus on refuting those criticisms. The Constitution, the Federalist Papers, then, have a political domain. They are not just pieces of analytical writing explaining how the Constitution of the United States will work. They are also political in their intent to convince people or make people realize why they should endorse the Constitution and why they should reject those who criticize it. It's very important to keep both of those in mind, because there's a tendency on the part of many people to take the Federalist Papers. I had a bite of popcorn while we were on break, and I'm choking on it. I apologize. There's a tendency among many people to take the Federalist Papers as gospel. And what I mean is to take what they say about the Constitution and the critics of the Constitution at face value, forgetting the political context within which they write. That there was a political agenda here. And because of that political agenda, that affects not only what the authors of the Federalist Papers say, but the way they say it. They are after political support, and their goal is to get people to support their side rather than the other side. And that's going to affect how they say, what they say, and how they say it. So there were a couple of Federalist Papers. We spent an awful lot of time on, if you remember, early on in our programming on the Virtual Center, we spent an awful lot of time on Federalist number 10. We spent a lot of time on Federalist number 51. Those two papers are considered by most scholars to be in many ways the most important of the Federalist Papers in terms of the way we teach the Constitution. Federalist 10 was Madison's explanation of how the Constitution would resolve the problems of the Confederation, problems which Madison himself identified or outlined in a document which he wrote early in 1787 before the convention met, called Vices of the Political System of the United States. In that document, Madison laid out 12 major criticisms of government under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution of the United States was designed to address many of those problems, and Federalist Number 10, more than any of the other Federalist Papers, is Madison's effort to explain how this exactly is going to work. And Federalist Number 51 is kind of an extension of that. It's about the internal system of checks and balances built into our constitutional system, which makes it impossible, according to Madison, for factions to gain power and use the system to their own advantage. Madison believes that a combination of separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial, in three branches of government, and creating a system of balance between different branches. In other words, building what he calls a balance of power in such a way that each of the three branches is both independent and yet has some element of control over the others. So the result is that in order to effect change in this system, you've got to overcome all these internal objections and opportunities and barriers that have been created to force the system to move slowly. Madison believes that because each branch of government is responsible to a different constituency, the House of Representatives to the people, the Senate to the states, the President to the board, the electors, the Electoral College, which are people elected in each state to cast the state's ballot for president. In other words, indirectly, it's the people that elect the president, but in reality, they do not. And then the Supreme Court, which is appointed by the president with approval of the United States Senate for life. By creating a system where the branches of government are separated and where each branch is accountable to a totally different constituency, each branch of which has some leverage over the other branches, that the sum total of internal checks and balances within the system makes the system invulnerable to efforts of majorities, whether they be majorities or minority factions, whether they be minority factions or majority factions, to seize power and carry out what it is that makes the faction a faction. In other words, makes it impossible for factions to gain power and enforce their will on the system, on the nation as a whole. That's Federalist Number 10 and, in a way, Federalist Number 51. And that's the reason why those two Federalist Papers are so significant. But last week we focused a little bit, we turned in one of our programs to Federalist Number 9. And the reason we focused on Number 9 is because obviously Number 10 comes right after that. And Madison's introduction to Federalist Number 10 suggests that it's a continuation of what was said in Number 9. And so it's very important then to go back to Number 9, because 9 sets the groundwork, or creates the context within which Madison wants us to read Federalist Number 10. And as we learned, if you read Number 9, what Publius is warning us about, and in this case, Number 9 was written by Hamilton. What Hamilton was warning us about was the danger of internal insurrection. The clearest example at that time was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in October of 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention met. And there's no question that the fear and the concerns generated by Shays' rebellion is what drove an awful lot of people to attend the Constitutional Convention. Because basically the supporters of change, the Federalists, did everything they could do to blow up Shays' rebellion and make it appear to be a lot more threatening and a lot more dangerous than it actually was. And it worked, because the result was that when the Constitutional Convention was scheduled to meet in May of 1787, after everybody got there, 12 of the 13 states were in attendance, whereas the year before, in Annapolis, in September of 1786, only 5 states showed up. So people felt, obviously the states felt, that the situation was much more drastic and much more dire. And there's no question that the existence of Shays, the outbreak of Shays' rebellion, had a large part to play in creating that kind of pressure on states to send delegates to Philadelphia. And so we looked at that, and that's what Hamilton's talking about in number 9, is the danger of insurrections. And what that does is lay the groundwork for what Madison's going to say about factions in Federalist number 10. There are other Federalist papers that are very significant. And while many, many people, and I don't care whether you're talking about students or graduate students or law students or whatever, throughout my career, I've run into many people who have said straight up that they, in a particular class or whatever, that they read the Federalist Papers. And I would suggest that that's probably, I'm not arguing that anybody's lying or anything, but I feel very, very strongly and very confident in saying that there aren't that many people that have really read the Federalist Papers. They are a tough read. Not only because the political system that they seek to explain and advocate is a complex one, but also because, again, there's a political side to this whole thing. And this is probably the most controversial aspect of all of this. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the Federalist Papers are written in a way which is designed intentionally to be over the heads of the majority of the population of the United States. The Federalist Papers are not written in order to explain the way the constitutional system is going to work to the average person. They are written instead to explain how the constitutional system is going to work to certain people. To the vast majority, these papers are going to be so confusing and so complex and so reliant on the passive voice and its constant use of the latter and the former and the former and the latter, that's bound to confuse all but the very, very astute reader. Consequently, I would suggest that the Federalist Papers are a tough read. And for people to say that they read the Federalist Papers, you don't challenge them. Now that's not the right thing to do. Obviously, you don't basically suggest to anybody that they're not telling you the truth. But the fact of the matter is, I think in most cases you can safely conclude that they may have read a few papers and they may have skimmed the others and they may know what each paper is about. But for somebody to honestly say that they read the Federalist Papers is a little bit suspicious. My guess is attorneys in law school probably have, and graduate students in these areas do. But the fact of the matter is, I have found it over the years very, very difficult. And what I find is that I keep going back to the Federalist Papers based on something I'm doing at a particular point in time. If I find that I'm very interested in a particular subject and a particular topic, then it usually doesn't take long before you begin to find reference and say, this is the same subject that's dealt with in Federalist number such and such and such and such. And at that point, I will go back and look at those Federalist Papers. So my sense is, over the years, I've probably read most of the Federalist Papers, but not sat down and read number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. In other words, I didn't read them the way they appeared in the New York papers. If I had been alive in 1788 when they were printed and in New York and read them one paper after the other, I may have done that. But chances are I probably wouldn't, because I'd be like most people. I probably would have been like most people and say, I'm not going to bother with it. I'll just wait for the movie. I'll wait and I'll see the movie. Because at some point somebody's going to put them all together and say, these are the highlights, this is what it's all about, and they're going to save me the need to read them. So here I am, 50 years into my study of this stuff, and I'm still amazed at the substance of the Federalist Papers, just as I continue to be amazed at the substance of some of the major Supreme Court decisions that over the years I've been exposed to, but I had never been inclined to read the majority opinion or to read the dissenting opinions in particular cases. And once you read those, you begin to get a sense of what the real meaning of the decision is or is not, that you would never get any other way. Here at the Virtual Center, for just as an example, and then I want to get into a couple of these Federalist Papers. But here at the Virtual Center, we spent quite a bit of time looking at the John Marshall decision in 1819 in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court ratified or adopted or spoke on the constitutionality of the United States Bank. I knew that. I knew what McCulloch versus Maryland was. I knew the very famous quote from the McCulloch case where Marshall said, the power to tax is the power to destroy, and therefore the state of Maryland did not have the power to tax the United States Bank in Baltimore, because knowing that state banks obviously had a vested interest in keeping federal banks out of their state, then if you condone the right of the state to tax the federal bank, then you're effectively giving them a weapon which they will use to destroy the United States Bank. I knew all of that. And I read some of the relevant quotes from the decision. But here at the Virtual Center, we read the whole thing. And what you find by reading the whole thing is that while McCulloch versus Maryland was based on the constitutionality of the United States Bank, and while the quotations that are the most well-known from this decision are indeed accurate, the fact of the matter is there's much more to that decision than the constitutionality of the United States Bank. What we found is that when Marshall renders that decision at the very beginning of the case, at the beginning of his decision on the constitutionality of the bank, he makes the point that a bank is a corporation. And to question the constitutionality of the bank is to question the constitutionality of government's right to incorporate businesses, to incorporate corporations. And the bulk of Madison's decision focuses not on the bank and the need for a bank so much as it does on the nation's need for corporations and the responsibility that governments have to subsidize corporations, but to not overregulate them. Because in the process of regulation, you could destroy the very basis on which the corporation was created in the first place. And John Marshall's position was a government that feels inclined, that is inclined to incorporate a business, whether it be a bank or whatever else, does so because the government believes that creation of that corporation would serve the public interest. And Marshall's conclusion is that to overregulate it would work counter to the public interest of the people. And so therefore, the government which creates a corporation in the public interest has an obligation to the public interest to not overregulate it, but to let it do the thing for which it was created. And what Marshall does in McCulloch versus Maryland is make the case for unregulated corporate free enterprise. He is making a case that the economic development and the future of this nation is contingent on the ability of money to organize and business to incorporate and to operate in the world of free exchange. And I would suggest to you that that may be uncomfortable, but there need to be alternatives short of abolishing all corporations, which is, I think, where people sometimes are inclined to go. Anyway, that's just an example of new information that sometimes surfaces by really reading these things that you never read before. And the point I'm making is, in all the textbooks that I've read and much of the literature that I've read, I can't remember reading anything in a secondary source where people talked about corporations in McCulloch versus Maryland, only about the bank. And what that leads me to believe is that most people looked up the decision to see what the court said about the legitimacy of the bank. But most of these people never read the decision, because if they did, there's no way in the world that they could ignore the fact that 2/3 of Marshall's commentary in his decision relates to corporations, not to the need for a bank specifically. And my guess is the same thing is true with the Federalist Papers. My guess is that people didn't read the Federalist Papers any more carefully than they read Supreme Court decisions like McCulloch versus Maryland or anything else. One of the issues, and this goes back several weeks, months here at the Virtual Center, but one of the issues that we spent some time on weeks ago was the nature of republicanism, the idea of a Republican government. And more specifically, on what constitutes a republic. What makes a republic a republic? We know that the founders went all the way back to the ancients. They looked at the Greeks and the Romans. They read Sallust and they read Cicero and they read Plato's allegory of the cave and Plato's Republic and various other things. And they looked at the republics that were created in Greece and in Rome when the Roman Republic was in existence. And they began to develop a sense of what makes a republic a republic. And so when the founders came to an agreement on independence, the one thing that they all agreed on is that the government we create must be a republican form of government. It must be a republic. The values that emerged from Great Britain and came to the New World in the colonies and in their charters contributed to Americans' commitment to republican government. The values that they subscribed to, the ideas of freedom, the ideas of participation of the people in decisions, the idea of consent of the governed, the idea in the limits on government's power, on the ideas on protecting private property, the ideas on creating a society which promotes equality, all of the things which end up in the Declaration of Independence and form the foundation for the Constitution of the United States, together defines a value system which makes a republic the only option with the decision to go for independence. So one of the most important aspects of the history of this period is concentrated effort to understand and try to appreciate the nature of republican government. In my writing, one of the things that I hit on, and this actually occurred before we started here at the Virtual Center, was the idea that in the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States, a substantive change in the meaning of republicanism was taking place. Americans were committed to the idea of a republic. We've talked about this before, but I believe it's very important, and we need to emphasize it again. Americans were committed to republican government. Americans were committed to the idea that the authority, the accepted authority on republicanism, was Montesquieu, and Montesquieu's very famous Spirit of the Laws. In his Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu talked about the importance of separation of powers. And the founders, of course, bought into that 100%. The idea that whatever government we set up, there must be a separation of powers. You can't have all the power in one branch of government. If you do, you have tyranny. They believe that up and down the line. There's nobody, supporter or opponent of the Constitution, who doesn't buy into that. But besides separation of powers, Montesquieu also spends an awful lot of time in his Spirit of the Laws on the idea of republican government itself. And his point is that throughout history, history teaches us that the only way to have successful republican government is to keep it small. The most successful republics, Montesquieu said, were in the former Greek city-states. Because in order to work, republicanism has to be small, because the key to republicanism is the connection between the people and their elected representatives. And of course, the big debate develops over the nature of the representative himself. In other words, over representation. Is the representative an independent decision maker who makes decisions in the name of the people who elected him? Or does the representative fulfill and carry out the will of the people as measured in polls or votes or elections or whatever? The trustee of the people or an agent of the people? Does the elected representative carry out the will of the people, or is the representative elected because of his ability to make the best decisions in behalf of the people who elected him? And there's a big debate over that. But Montesquieu's argument is, even if you believe that the representative has power to make decisions, in order for Republican government to work, the representative must make decisions which satisfy the wants and needs of the people he represents. Consequently, the republic has to be small, because only then would the representative be able to know and be familiar with the needs and wants of his own people. Montesquieu's concern is that if a republic becomes too big, it encompasses too many competing interests and groups, and it becomes impossible for the representative to know what the will of the people as a whole really is. And so consequently, the representative ends up becoming an independent decision maker, because it's not possible to read the will of the people, since the people are so spread out and there are so many different groups of people contained within the republic itself. So Montesquieu's argument is that a republic has to be small. Madison and the Federalists' position with the Constitution of the United States is that even though the Constitution of the United States is creating a government with power on the national level, it still remains a republic, because it is built upon the ingredients of what makes for a Republican government. My position in my writing has been that in Federalist number 10, Madison is telling us that by creating a large republic, he is intentionally making it impossible for the representative to know all the interests within his constituency. More importantly, it is impossible for the majority constituency within his constituency to even organize, because they're so spread out that they cannot, and this is Madison's term in Federalist number 10, they cannot join together and execute their plans of oppression. To Madison, majority rule by a majority of the people is oppression. It's oppression of the minority by an uncontrolled majority. And Madison's position is, you've got to make that impossible. You've got to prevent that from ever happening. And that's his major complaint about the states under the Articles of Confederation, as that decisions in the states were being made increasingly by majority pressures. Representatives were merely doing what the people told them to do. Power was in the wrong hands, and the Constitution of the United States was going to resolve it by putting it back in the right hands. So in a sense, the position that I've taken in my writing is that while the name Republican still exists with the ratification of the Constitution, the substance and meaning of Republican government has changed 180 degrees. Because no longer is it possible for Montesquieu's idea of a small republic controlled by the people through their representatives to even be possible. What Madison and the Federalists have done by creating the National Republic is to create much larger constituencies, which makes majority rule impossible. Therefore, makes accountability of the representative to the majority impossible, which in turn renders the representative an independent decision maker. So while the form of Republican government is retained, people still vote, people still elect their representatives, representatives still come back to the people and explain their voting patterns, why this is the way I voted and this is why I voted that way. And there are still election campaigns, and there are still banners and signs and broadsides and bulletins and position papers and editorials in the newspapers and everything that we associate with popular government and Republican government and campaigns and political elections and everything else. The one thing that is different is the ultimate focus or source of power. Power has shifted from the constituents to the government. They still call it a republic because it still looks like a republic. But as Madison says in Federalist number 10, the major challenge that the convention faced was to create a government that was so structured internally that it could control the violence of faction without disturbing the spirit and the form of popular government. It would be a government that still looked like it was a republic, but in reality, it could not operate like a republic. I would suggest that transition, that change, is one of the most important changes that the Constitution of the United States fulfills, brings into existence. There is a Federalist paper written by James Madison in which Madison addresses the nature of Republican government. And it is Federalist number 39. And so what I would like to do here at the Virtual Center, we don't obviously have but about 6 or 7 minutes left in today's program, is to spend some time looking at Federalist number 39 and looking at Madison's explanation of Republican government. Because it is my belief, it is my position, that this is the most significant change in the transition from government under the Articles of Confederation to government under the Constitution of the United States. What Madison is going to do, what the Federalists are going to do, is make the case that the nature of Republican government as they define it is much more consistent with the ideal of republicanism than was the Articles of Confederation, than was the Confederation itself. In fact, what the Federalist Papers do, and I think it's brilliant, is to point out that even the states under the Articles of Confederation violated Montesquieu's version of Republican government. Talk about turning the argument totally around and throwing it in the face of your opponents. What the Federalists are able to do to those who defend the Articles of Confederation by defending Republican government as defined and explained by Montesquieu, the Federalists respond in the Federalist Papers by pointing out that none of the states under the Confederation really conforms to Montesquieu at all. In other words, their position is our opponents speak with forked tongue because they are defending the continuation of a system which they are arguing is republicanism as Montesquieu originally explained that it needed to operate. But in fact, every state government violates that principle. So consequently, what they've done, is they have made the case that the republicanism that the anti-federalists are trying to defend under the Articles of Confederation never really existed anyway. And so consequently, what they are doing in the Constitution is a very noble, positive effort to fix republicanism in order to make sure that it conformed to the ideal model. So in a sense, what the Federalists are doing is flipping the anti-federalist case and using it against them. It is an absolutely brilliant strategy for argumentation. But again, it is political. It is a political strategy. It is designed to accomplish political ends. It is not an ideal, objective analysis of the Constitution of the United States as Republican. That's not it at all. What they are doing instead is setting out to paint republicanism with a different brush and to convince the American people that the republicanism that they thought they had never really existed anyway. So consequently, we're going to fix that. So you need to support us and work with us while we create republicanism that really is republicanism. Absolutely brilliant, brilliant strategy. And in Federalist number 39, Madison himself addresses the issue of republicanism. But the groundwork for that is laid in many of the Federalist Papers that go before it. In fact, Hamilton, in the very first Republican Federalist paper, number 1, makes the case for what Madison is going to argue in Federalist number 39. It is absolutely, this stuff is absolutely fantastic when you consider the political context in which it's happening. It ain't dull, in spite of what our school kids tell us in our government classes and various other things. This stuff is not dull. It's very meaningful It's filled with intrigue, and it's brilliant. And when you accept the reality of the challenge that the founders faced, you can't help but admire them. I look at the old clock on the wall, and it tells me that we have reached the top of the hour, and I can, in my mind, I can see Bob Kincaid winding up to begin his program at the top of the hour. So it's time for us to get out of his way, and thank you for listening to the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. Be safe, and thank you. We'll be back tomorrow.